Hello. Today, you will hear an incredible story. I grew up without my mother. She left me and my father when I was barely a year old. I found out a long time later that she had run off with a lover. Apparently, there was no place in her happy future for me. My family tried not to mention my mother. Only once my grandmother said that my mother had gone to get a happy life and was now living somewhere abroad. I did not specify anything, and my grandmother never returned to this conversation. One thing I do not understand even now, how she was able to abandon her one-year-old child and not once during this time do not remember him. Women often reproach men for being too cruel. On the way to personal happiness, a woman will stop at nothing. She will sweep away everything in her way. Everything, including her own children. My father, after my mother's departure, did not marry for a long time. Did he love me? It's hard to say unequivocally. Sometimes it seemed to me that his resentment against his wife who had run away was transferred to me. At any rate, I lived at my grandmother's, and my father occasionally visited me, bringing me some toy. He devoted his life to work and his career. He was lucky enough to own a big, thriving construction company. When I was 14 years old, my father got married. I remember the wedding well. The groom, a 40-year-old stately man, and the bride, a young, dazzlingly beautiful girl, Lena, almost 20 years younger. Guests, toasts, a fancy restaurant. That's how I got my stepmother. A year after my father got married, my grandmother died. She left me her apartment, but I had to live with my father until I came of age. How I hated my stepmother. All her attempts to get closer to me were met with cold, distant silence. She tried in vain to find common ground with me. She cooked delicious food for me, bought me clothes. She packed sandwiches for school. When I got sick, she wouldn't leave my bedside. But all in vain. My hatred for her only grew in me. With all that, I didn't understand the nature of my attitude toward her. Jealous of my mother? I didn't even know her. Jealous of my father? But I was not spiritually close to him. I say more. I was indifferent to him. Unmotivated childish hatred, complete rejection of the man. I once stole a beer from a supermarket. Not because I didn't have any money, but for no reason at all. It was Lena who came to rescue me from the police. At home, she tried to explain to me that drinking beer and stealing is not good. To which I defiantly muttered, "What are you, my mother?" I saw tears come to her eyes. She got up and left the room in silence. She said nothing to her father about the accident. When I turned 18, I went into the army. After a year of service, I entered a military school. I didn't want to go home. For years later, I got out of the army and immediately found myself in one of the numerous hotspots. I don't remember that battle in particular. The winter sun was setting, and it was very cold. At last, the setting sun was hidden behind the clouds, which meant that not a tragic ray of light would betray us. Reflected from the weapons or the eyepieces of our binoculars. In the distance to the right, a gray ribbon stretched the river. Below us was the enemy. Our task was simple to the utmost and consisted in determining the enemy's position and giving the coordinates to the artillery. The god of war worked next. My radio operator had already started transmitting data about the enemy when suddenly a machine gun hit us from the rear. The bullets were digging into the ground around me. My radio operator cried out and dropped his head beside me. I answered with short bursts, trying to see my enemy in the darkness. At the same time, I tried to get on the intercom to my commander. Alas, the enemy had settled on our frequency and intelligently jammed the communications, and all I could hear in my headphones was crackling. No one else was firing from our side except me. I realized that my men had been killed in the first minutes of the battle. Only one thought bothered me. Had the radio operator managed to transmit the coordinates of the enemy to the gunners? Soon I was out of ammo. I pulled out my pistol and fumbled for a spare clip. Two shadows rushed toward me from the right. Without aiming, I fired several times in their direction. I knew I couldn't get out, but I decided to sell my life for the highest price. I turned to the dead radio operator and covering his body turned on the radio station. Luckily, there was no damage. I switched to the spare frequency, which the enemy did not know yet, and began transmitting the coordinates of my target, thus calling the artillery fire on me. The machine gunner detected my movement and opened fire again. I felt the bullets digging into the dead radio operator's body. I wasn't scared. I was just mentally already dead, knowing clearly that only a miracle could save me. The lie thing I remembered was the whistling of the shells and the roar of the explosions all around. I was badly wounded. It was a very dangerous wound, and I had lost a lot of blood. And when I was taken to the hospital, I was in a critical condition. My father didn't want to come because he was busy. Lena came. I was in a coma, but the guys told me that she hadn't left my side all that time. She even got a temporary job at our hospital as a nurse to be with me. When I went to recover, she left apparently afraid of the unpredictable reaction of a little bastard, which I must have remained in her memory. On my bedside table, I found of expensive Swiss Army watches and a note with just one word on it: "Get well." After a month, I had fully recovered. Intensive therapy and youthfulness. That was the secret of my speedy recovery. I also fell in love. AITA worked in the hospital as a nurse. There was number one better for me than her. Slim with green eyes with a mist, she for me was the epitome of the best qualities of a woman. Sometimes I caught the envious glances of my ward mates, and I was bursting with pride that this beauty had chosen me out of the large number of males that inhabited this population. As a result, by the time I was discharged from the hospital, I was ripe for marriage. Besides, Olga was already transparently hinting at it. At the medical commission, the kind doctors took a long time to examine me, looked at my analyses and cardiogram and gave me the following conclusion: I was fit for further service without any limitations. I was given a monthly for rehabilitation and marriage. Right after our wedding, Olga and I went to the south to the sea. Then we stayed with her parents and sister. But everything comes to an end sometime. My leave came to an end too. I got my notice and went with my young wife to a new duty station. I soon got into the rhythm of military life. I was appointed a company commander of a separate reconnaissance battalion, and I had almost no free time. I spent days at my unit. Olga was sitting without work, gradually transforming from a sweet girl into a ruthless bitch. People go crazy from idleness, all the more so for young, unexperienced women. I tried my best to support my wife, understanding that this was not an easy time for her. Alia was already pregnant. I really hoped that she would change for the better with the baby, and I looked expectantly at her well-rounded belly. Was I having a good time with her? I think so. She did love me. In spite of everything, after my daughter was born, life began to get better. Olga took care of our daughter all the time and our relationship improved noticeably. But I began to notice that sometimes there was a chill between us. Olga kept away from me, averting her eyes in conversation. I didn't bother with any nonsense. I was absorbed in the service and family problems. Olga was so exhausted during the day that she had no strength to get up at night to see the child. I tried my best to help my wife. I nursed my daughter at night, changed diapers and sometimes fell asleep in the inn with my head against the refrigerator. But time went inexorably forward, my daughter grew up, and our family life gradually settled down. We lived like that for another year. Olga and her daughter went to their parents for the whole summer. The grandparents did not dote on their granddaughter. And the changes for Olga was good for Olga. She came back tender and affectionate. Our intimate life after that was again filled with bright colors. At the end of the summer, our battalion was deployed as part of a UN peacekeeping force in Mali. A civil war broke out there, and the peacekeepers were ensuring the separation of the warring parties. At first, we corresponded with Olga. She told me the news, wrote me how her daughter was growing up. But over time, the letters became fewer and fewer until they stopped altogether. 6 months later, I was recalled and the first flight home. I didn't know why the trip was over before the deadline, but I didn't really care. Having arrived, even at the airport, I tried to call Olga, but her phone was off. Leaving my duffel bag in the hallway, I went into the apartment. There was number 1 in the large living room, but a man's voice and a woman's laughter could be heard from the kitchen. I was careful not to creak the floorboards, approached the kitchen and opened the door a little. A man stripped to the waist was sitting at the table with a glass in his hands. On his lap, laughing shrilly, was my auger in a short t-shirt. I immediately recognized in this macho, the head of the military shop. What a bastard! There had long been rumors in our garrison that he was harassing officers' wives. Rumors are rumors, but number 1 ever caught him red-handed. But now he's been caught. My hand involuntarily began to pull out the tactical knife hanging in its plastic sheath on my right hip. Strangely enough, for some reason, I was not surprised by what was happening. It seemed as if I was seeing this erotic show from the sidelines. It was as if I had been prepared for such a turn of events beforehand. I just felt a fleeting, but very painful prick of the heart. My whole life together with Olga flashed before my eyes in an instant. For a moment, I thought that it was all a bad dream, that I was about to wake up and see my beloved wife sleeping next to me. That she would smile in her sleep as usual and hug me tenderly with her warm hand. The reality was so hurtful and unfair that tears even appeared in my eyes. Finally, they saw me. Olga recoiled in horror, and her bow slowly rose, keeping his fat, frightened eyes on the knife in my hand. Don't. Euro, please don't. I'll explain everything now. In a frightened voice, my wife whispered. She apparently thought that I was about to kill them both. A puddle formed under the lover, a sharp smell of urine. He looked like he was wetting himself with fear. I smoked and put the knife back where it belonged. Spitting under my feet, I turned around and without saying a word walked out of the kitchen. Olga, sobbing, ran after me. Something tearfully shouted, tried to stop me, grabbing my hands on his jacket. But I silently pulled her away with my hand, grabbed my duffel bag and stepped out the door. Dear listeners, please like and subscribe to our channel. It stimulates me to